talk about my one job title, which is managing the Asian Carp program on behalf of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. The program is managed out of Burlington, Ontario, and we have satellite groups in Sault Ste. Marie and Winnipeg as well associated with the program. I'm going to take a step back and go through a little bit of history on Asian carp, because it really is an interesting mix of science informing policy, which is why I think Nick thought to bring this presentation to you today. In 2004, Fisheries and Oceans Canada did conduct a risk assessment on 5 species of Asian carp. You're probably familiar with 4 of them: bighead, silver, grass, and black, but we also conducted a risk assessment on large-scale silver carp as well. And we were asked to do this risk assessment to answer basically one question: do Asian carps pose a risk to Canadian waters? So for the 4 species that we're well aware of, we answered the question, yes, Asian carps, the 4 species, pose a high risk to Canadian waters. As an aside, the large-scale silver carp did not pose a risk. Since that time in 2004, what we were seeing in the United States was an impending invasion. The population moving further and further up the Mississippi River Basin, getting closer towards the Great Lakes. We were also seeing a lot more concern from the U.S. government on these species, a lot more funding being flooded into the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative on the U.S. side, and a lot of research being done on bighead and silver carp especially. So we had in 2011 a lot of questions. Now that we knew more about these species, we were getting a lot more concerned. The U.S. was wondering how best to prevent or manage the species, and Canada was feeling that they needed a little bit more specific information specific to the Great Lakes. So we were tasked to complete another risk assessment. We focused on bighead and silver carp, which were the priorities of our managers, who were the clients, the Great Lakes Basin managers. And we conducted that risk assessment with coordination, help from the Great Lakes Fishery Commission and our co-authors from the Fishery Commission, as well as U.S. Geological Survey. But we had input from numerous U.S. federal, state, from our colleagues at the province of Ontario, as well as academic institutions from both sides of the border, providing research and input to help answer a lot of key questions that Great Lakes Basin managers had concerning bighead and silver carp. So some of the key results were that in terms of points of arrival, that the Chicago area waterway system was likely the most likely entry route into the Great Lakes Basin, obviously the first entry point being Lake Michigan. It was noted that there were other physical connections that connected the Mississippi River Basin and the Great Lakes Basin together, but those were a lower risk. And we did note that there was another way that these species could get into the Great Lakes Basin, and that was through live trade. But we didn't have a lot of information to help support a good rating on risk for that. Key results for survival. Well, we knew from previous work, thank you, Matthias, that Asian carp would definitely survive in the Great Lakes Basin, and that enough food and habitat was available in the Great Lakes Basin for the fishes to not only survive but also overwinter. We knew that in times of lack of food, that they would even switch to bottom debris and even pseudofeces from zebra mussels in order to survive. These species are survivors, which makes them great invaders. And we found out that they would not compete with zebra mussels. In terms of establishment, work done by Nick Mandrak found that there were up to 57 Canadian rivers that provided suitable spawning habitat for bighead and silver carp. We knew there was extensive wetland areas available for nursery habitat of these species. And modeling work done by Martin Poops and his staff found that as few as 10 females and equal number of males provided a greater than 50% chance of annual successful spawning. In terms of spread, following introduction into a single lake, Modeling showed that the species would be expected to spread to the other lakes within 20 years, and that the spread would be more rapid for the central lakes, like Michigan, Huron, and Erie, and that it would be potentially for Lake Superior, and it would definitely take longer for Lakes Ontario. The reason being is that Lake Erie provided such suitable habitat for them that they would be less inclined to move on to Lake Ontario. So in terms of consequences, we expected to see, and this is a lot of work being done by DFO and the province of Ontario, food web modeling. We expected to see a decline in obviously planktivores and then in turn piscivores as well. These would include some life stages of yellow perch and walleye. So overall, the science advice stemming from this binational risk assessment was if there were no additional actions taken, the overall ecological risk of big-headed silver carps, known as the big-headed carps, was high, especially to the central lakes, and that we would expect to see these impacts to increase over time. And that the impact on the Great Lakes was directly related to that establishment phase in the invasion process. Therefore, preventing establishment is critical. That was the advice given to the Great Lakes managers. Some Great Lakes managers are dealing with an invasion in process, and some are dealing with an invasion that has not yet occurred, for example, in Canada. So for Canada, it was recommended that we need to focus on prevention. So from this, key pieces of science advice, a program was developed. So the government of Canada saw the results of this risk assessment, felt that this was indeed a priority in order to protect the Great Lakes, to work with our provincial partners and our American partners, and develop an Asian carp program. The program is completely based on the science advice that was provided from the 2011 Binational Risk Assessment, and new money was provided to Fisheries and Oceans Canada for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017. The focus area is the Great Lakes. We do include all 4 species, so even though the risk assessment was done on bighead and silver carp, we are looking at, as well, grass and black carp. And the program consists of what we call 4 pillars. And Kelly, I was struck by your presentation where you noted these exact same pillars. So we're all thinking on the same wavelength, which is great. The first pillar is prevention, where we look at outreach, engaging Canadians, educating stakeholders and the public, conducting scientific research to help answer some key questions, risk assessment. The second pillar is obviously early warning, using both traditional and genetic techniques in order to detect as early as possible any Asian carp individuals in Canadian waters. Response, we do not have rapid response because not all response will be rapid. But in terms of that, not only responding in an active way to any finds of Asian carp or any credible sightings, it's also just being prepared within DFO, having our incident command training, emergency preparedness, a business continuity plan. So if we found Asian carp, all other work stops, and we have to address Asian carp findings. And also this allows us to collaborate fully with our provincial partners as well as our U.S. partners, considering the Great Lakes is an international body of water. And the last pillar is management. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about each detail and try to tie in where I can some of the information that was provided from the risk assessment. So in terms of outreach, we did sponsor an Asian carp science management session at the International Conference of Aquatic Invasive Species held in Niagara Falls, and I recommend many people attended that meeting. The purpose of that meeting was to hear some of the cutting edge work that's being done in the United States and to help identify for Canada what kind of work we could be doing in terms of the science in order to inform management. We certainly don't want to duplicate any efforts. We are playing in a much different financial ballpark than the U.S., so we really need to be conservative with our funds and make sure we're not duplicating efforts. We also work directly with key stakeholders, for example, commercial fishermen. We've sent out ID sheets and have let them know what they should do if they came across Asian carp. The provinces is also working with commercial fishermen as well. And we're working on building partnerships. There are a lot of groups out there that have a set program in terms of engaging Canadians with invasive species, and we certainly want to leverage that expertise and that experience. And two of the groups that we are currently working with is the Ontario Invasive Species Centre, who is creating basically a social media campaign. So for those of you on Facebook and Twitter, you can now follow that campaign at Asian Carp CA. They are also creating a Canadian Asian Carp website, which would allow all agencies and members of the Canadian public to access information on what all the agencies and groups are doing with respect to Asian Carp. That will be asiancarp.ca, and that website's being mocked up right now and should be available shortly. The Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters has an impressive campaign, the Invading Species Awareness Program. So we partnered with them in order to take that campaign and add very specific Asian carp aspects to that. They're developing public education and outreach materials, billboards, magazine ads, public service announcements in order to get information out to the public. How we tie that back into the risk assessment is the advice from the risk assessment says prevention is key. And we can't do it alone. We need as many eyes out in the water as possible, and in order to do that, we need to get the message out that the threat that these species pose and what can everybody do about it. In terms of research, we have a lot of ongoing projects underway. The first one is looking at ways that if prevention failed, we don't want to wait until prevention failed in order to research how best to contain or control Asian carp. Now, we recognize there's a lot of work being done in the United States on this effort. A lot of the work, though, is for river habitats. We're dealing with lake habitats. So we're doing the complementary work on control and containment research at our facility. Laser. At our facility at the Canada Centre for Inland Waters. I was going to point out my office, but I overlooked this unused boat slip. So we've netted off the end of this boat slip, and we're looking at physical barriers such as electricity, acoustic barriers, pressure barriers, or as the U.S. likes to call it, water guns. But very Canadian of us, we're calling it pressure barriers. And looking at also CO2 barriers. Now, a lot of this work will be done complementary and in partnership with the U.S. Geological Survey as well as universities. So we were really cognizant of not duplicating effort, but adding to the body of knowledge. We are also tagging fish to better understand movement of fish through canals. And we have a history, we know that fish move through canals. But is there ecological traits of certain fish that make them better, more able for spread, or is there ways to understand how fish spread through canals that would help inform either an early detection kind of gate through potential canals, or for containing and controlling fish in canals? Much easier to deal with a concrete structure that's built like a box than it is to deal with a natural habitat. So that work is year three underway, and is part of a larger acoustic tagging study, or acoustic tagging work being done in the Great Lakes as well as the Illinois River Basin. We did identify up to 57 Canadian rivers that would provide suitable spawning habitat. This has been very helpful for me to direct my crews where they're going to go to look for Asian carp in this early detection. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack that's constantly moving. So we need some science to help tell us where we need to go. So we use this information as our starting point, but if we could refine that, and of those 57, what are the top 10 most likely places that we could find Asian carp, that would help improve our efficiency even more. So we're looking at refining that tributary work and also expanding it to black carp and grass carp as well. We are looking next month, we will be hosting, our Great Lakes Fishery Commission actually will be hosting a meeting for scientists around the Great Lakes Basin who would be interested in letting us know any grass carp research that they're undertaking, or interested in undertaking any grass carp research. And so if you're interested in that, please let me know. And we're also doing research into genetic tools such as environmental DNA work. In terms of risk assessment, this is a very valuable tool for providing advice for Canada and the US in terms of, for management, in terms of prevention and control of Asian carp. We have just launched another binational risk assessment focused on grass carp, and we are in discussion on how to conduct a black carp risk assessment as well. It will be assessed, it's just timing. So in early warning, our second pillar, and obviously an important pillar in terms of the invasive species program, taking the work done by Nick Mandrak, we identified potential sites for setting up an early detection site. And we scouted out 24 sites in Lakes Huron and Lakes Huron and Erie last year. And of those 24 sites, we felt that 22 would be ideal for setting up an early detection site. And these are areas of highest risk for revival as well as establishment, tracking Asian carp. We are establishing monitoring programs with our traditional gear. We're using 6-foot hoop nets, techniques developed in Illinois. These fish are net avoiders. They're not actually they look dopey, but they're quite smart. They're net avoiders and they're difficult to catch, so it really takes a lot of active technique and active sampling in order to detect them. And while we're out there, honestly, we're hoping never to find an Asian carp, but while we're out there, we might as well conduct a baseline survey of the fish community in order to have that pre-impact baseline should Asian carp arrive. So we're taking the opportunity to sample what's out there. Along with our traditional gear early detection sampling, we are looking at environmental DNA as a tool in our surveillance toolbox. Because we do have Asian carp in our live food trade, we know DNA can survive through the grey water and the sewage systems in Toronto. We want to make sure that we're using this tool as an early surveillance tool in the appropriate places so that when we get an answer, as a manager, I understand what that answer means. We do collect water samples, and so does the province of Ontario. We conduct the filtration aspect of it in Burlington, and we ship those filters to our genetics lab in Winnipeg. The third pillar, response, we can break this down into two pieces. One half of response is actually active action, so actively responding to an Asian carp detected in Canadian waters. Last year we did capture 2 grass carp in the Grand River, and within hours of the first time and within seconds of the second time, we were in active rapid response mode. Now, of course, response will vary. Immediately we assume that this is a spawning individual. Worst case scenario. But important piece of information, especially concerning Asian carp, whether or not that the species is a triploid or a diploid, so fertile or infertile. And that's important information for us to know because, for example, grass carp are made infertile and stocked in the Great Lakes Basin. So we know Asian carp can swim long distances. So while if we capture one, we assume the worst, but the potential is there for it to have been a stray, infertile individual from the US. So what we've had to do previously is take a tissue sample and send it to La Crosse, Wisconsin. And inevitably it gets held up at the border, especially because the tissue sample is an eyeball. And that can take up to 3-4 days before we get an answer. So we have developed the technology and the ability to conduct ploidy testing on all Canadian specimens captured and provide that answer within hours. In terms of some sort of the other operational side of things, we're having training conducted on incident command. We're providing input and the ability to coordinate with the province, with our American partners, We're developing equipment inventory, so if we need to know who's got the big nets out there, we don't have to start calling around. We can go to a database and find out who does have that big net, contact them immediately and get the nets out to a site within hours. And as I mentioned before, in terms of for DFO, our work stops when we catch an Asian carp. So the work that we stop, how is that going to continue? So we need a business continuity plan as well as internal organization. So who are the people we pick that know that they will be called at any moment during the summer months to go out into the river. And it's always me and always on a Friday. Right, Jeff? Always a Friday. The last pillar, management. This is not fish management. We don't have Asian carp in Canadian waters, so we're not managing a population, but there are a lot of management actions that can be done. I mentioned a couple of times multi-agency coordination. Basin-wide, under the White House Council of Environmental Quality, we have an Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee, that's federal, state, provincial agencies that coordinate and oversee all Asian carp activities happening in the basin, as well as a lot of work, obviously, with our partners in Ontario. The program provided support for evisceration. I have here the provincial regulatory amendment, but also what Tracy was talking about, support for this to be included in the national regulations as well. We have provided identification training and supplies to border services officers, frontline officers, for conducting shipment inspections. We have analyzed for the province of Ontario confirmation of identification, as well as analyzed whether the species was wild caught or farm bred. Sea specimens for court cases, and Nick was a witness in one of those court cases last summer. And also the program is fully supporting the national AIS regulations in development that Tracy spoke of. So moving into the future, this program has been good, very good, in terms of getting AIS more on the radar screen for Canadians. We were talking with Chad last night about poster children. These are poster children for sure. And we're even using that to support our obligations under the Great Lakes, the Binational Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which has a new annex in it, which formally makes responsibility for aquatic invasive species work by Canada and the U.S. Is formally regulated. So we can use a lot of the work that we're doing on Asian carp to meet those requirements, as well as to build upon a broader framework in the future. As I mentioned, it's only a 5-year program, so we have funding until March 2017. But as we're working on Asian carp, it's great that we have funding for this group of species, but we recognize that there are many AIS issues in the Great Lakes. Definitely the hot spot for aquatic invasive species in Canada, but it's not the only hot spot. We have a lot of issues across Canada, marine and freshwater, and we're facing those issues in terms of preventing them. We're dealing with impacts, and we're dealing with, as Matthias was saying, control issues across the country. So our hope is that we can use the Asian Carp program as a foundation to indicate that you can do good work if the program is properly funded. So we're hoping that we can go back to the government, to the Treasury Board of Canada, and let them recognize that we need to broaden our scope a little bit. And of course, you just never know who's going to be the next poster child. Again, this is, as I said, another species that comes out of the water, and I think that's why these species are getting a lot more attention for aquatic invasive species, because they've certainly been hidden from the public's view. Unlike forest invaders, when people are seeing their trees dying, it gets their attention. So when species are coming out of the surface of the water, like Asian carp, like snakehead, I think that we can make use of that and build a more awareness, not only for the Canadian public, but for the governments as well. That's it.
Questions? Justin.
You mentioned that Asian carp is a poster child for invaders these days. But are you worried at all that we might be crying wolf a little bit and sort of working against ourselves to get public support. If we pitch this out there as a potentially terrible invader, but there's a lot of uncertainty as to whether or not it could really even survive, especially trying to make it all the way from across Lake Michigan and through Lake Huron and stuff. I just worry as a scientist a little bit that, like you said, when I try to bring up an invader that's having these major impacts already, but people aren't aware of it, and then they say, the first thing I say is, well, what about Asian carp, you know? So they know about it, but my fear is that we're sort of putting it out there as a poster child and maybe working against ourselves and our cause a little bit.
I would say that we're not putting it out there as a poster child, and so the Canadian public is taking it. And any species that can get that attention and then we can redirect it, I think is useful. To answer your question, do you think we're crying wolf? I don't at all. We have done a risk assessment which was vigorously peer-reviewed that showed that these species will survive, absolutely, and that they will have an impact in the ecosystem. Does that mean they're the only species? Absolutely not. So what I hope to do with this program is to deal with Asian carp issue, but build upon that and get recognition that we have a serious problem with other species as well.
I was just wondering why it's the eye of the carp that you send across the border versus you special.
The genetic, and I'm not a geneticist, so somebody knows jump in and help, but the genetic material in the eye is quite stable. So it preserves well and ships well. So that's what we use now. And if we can get a specimen that's live in Canada, we wouldn't have to necessarily use the eyeball genetic material, the fluid, although my staff's been busy plucking eyeballs and dissecting eyeballs all week learning the technique, but if we had a live individual, we could use blood. But of course, possessing a live Asian carp is against the provincial law. So we need to have a backup by understanding how we can use the eyeball as well. So we have the ability to use both blood and eyeball fluid.
Gary.
I was wondering what other species might be in the pipeline for receiving similar focus to the Asian carp. And in relation to that, if you might have any trouble receiving the kind of funding and support that you have in studying something that's so high profile, like the Asian carp, in comparison to another species that might not be such an obvious high impact invasive species, but might have an equally high impact.
So your first question, what other species are in the pipeline? We have problems across Canada, absolutely. Green crab out in Newfoundland, zebra mussels in Lake Winnipeg. We've got issues everywhere on the ground. So in terms of controlling spread and controlling populations, we have a problem. Things in the pipeline on the way to Canada. I can only speak of the Great Lakes right now, and certainly Tony's identified killer shrimp as a threat. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has released a study that identified scud, an amphipod, and also on our radar screen, I would say just on our radar screen, and not raising a flag, it would be snakehead species as well, specifically northern snakehead for the Great Lakes. I think other species may be a problem for Matthias to deal with, but for the Great Lakes, it would just be one species. So DFO has learned its lessons from dealing with zebra mussels, sea lamprey, which costs us millions and millions of dollars a year to manage them to a level that their impact is acceptable. So millions of dollars, $32 million I think it is, in the Great Lakes for sea lamprey, and we can't even get rid of them. We're just managing them to a level that their impact is acceptable. We've learned from that. It is, as one of the other presenters said, it is more cost effective to go front end on prevention. So those pipeline pieces are very important for DFO, to think about what could be coming and how could we stop it. And that's why we do conduct quite a few risk assessments on behalf of the government of Canada.
Ivan. the actions that you take in detection and prevention, how does it fit with Environment Canada's strategy? Are you working in silos, or do you work together on that?
Sorry, what was the first part, in terms of action and prevention?
Well, no, in terms of detection and prevention, which you're doing now.
Yep.
Are you working with Kelly on in Environment Canada on the strategy? Is that part of the whole strategy development and stuff?
Well, the strategy is that Kelly was speaking of is an umbrella strategy, and DFO does have a strategy underneath that that's very specific to aquatic invasive species. The two definitely complement each other, but it is sort of an underneath of that umbrella. We do work with a lot of the other agencies in terms of aquatic invasive species, not siloed. Ballast water probably being the most notable, with Transport Canada and DFO collaborating. But we're also doing a lot of work with Forest Services Agency to better understand what's moving through a different pathway, live trade. So there's a lot of collaborative work underway. But yeah, could we do better? Absolutely. But in terms of this program, the influx of funds and resources has enabled us to really better build the relationships that we need to do. We can't do this alone. We shouldn't be working in silos. And we're showing that building partnerships with international government agencies, other government departments, non-governmental organizations, as that network, we can do a lot of good.
I guess it's more a comment, but I think the Asian carp is a good example how kind of on-the-ground policy gets driven by, public perception, political will, which then, as a practitioner, you make the most out of it. And while it's not the ideal thing, because ideally you obviously develop a long list of species, do in-depth risk assessment, prioritize, focus on the high priority species, it still is an opportunity for us to develop a program, and then as it develops and the understanding builds, you can start also nudging it a bit into other directions. So I think that has to be recognized. While clearly there's a risk just using a poster child, and yes, if it comes in and you can't do anything, then it's a public failure and it's not good for invasive species, but still gives you the opportunity to develop a program, develop procedures, and hopefully build understanding as well. I think it's important to recognize by people who are not necessarily on the ground trying to do that stuff, that this is how we often have to do things. Right?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's a really good comment. Sometimes you have to take what's given to you. You don't always get what you ask for, as we discussed over beer last night. But that's exactly what you have to do. If you put your blinders on and you're just focused on this, you're going to miss the opportunity for the bigger issue. And that's why, even though I'm here to talk about just Asian carp, I do have to know we have a bigger problem on our hands across the country.